Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 11th edition of Coffee with Ashish. And today we have a very special guest with us, Rakshit Desai from FCM Travel. And before we get into conversation with him, as always, just wanted to recapture all the sessions we were having in the last few weeks. And I think, among other things, corporate travel is something which we haven't really touched upon in detail. And you might remember from few sessions a couple of weeks back, we discussed that corporate travel is actually the one which has been responsible for the entire innovation in the travel space historically. In fact, the travel word also comes from the French word travail, which means to work. So in many ways, one doesn't look at corporate travel. It sounds glamorous, but we all discussed that, it's a lot of hard work. And now people are anticipating that when this lockdown is going to be over, corporate travel is something which will first start because people might not travel for leisure to begin with. But many companies are also jittery in terms of what would be the protocols. Today, you would have seen in the news, the minister talking about that middle seat will not be removed. People are having speculations around would they need to wear masks and suits? Will the aviation staff need to wear those hazmat clothing or not? People are talking about containment on the number of baggage you can, carry, and all this has created sort of massive speculation and confusion. And in fact, people are also wondering if whose job sort of depended on travel. I remember when I used to be in Deloitte a few years back, we used to hire for sales team, and one of the job skill was, do you like travel? Are you open to traveling? And I think that job skill is now going to be completely changed. That are you good in doing webinars? Can you do remote sessions well or not? So I've got a small cartoon as always to capture this mood, that how that post-COVID environment might look like. So if you see this cartoon on the left, where you can see people think that he's a health professional, but he's actually a pilot, and that's how you might see in the airport. You wouldn't be able to differentiate who's a healthcare professional and who is a aviation staff. Bottom below is actually the more scary one, where you have a situation of somebody having in-flight, case of corona, and then ATC is not letting them to land if they are in midair. And the right one is the one I was talking about, where the job skill of liking to travel, or for the sake of exaggeration, flying to travel, becomes a more looked at job skill. So these are the kind of anticipations we are living at, and most leaders are all sort of looking at each other for support and inspiration. And I think we are lucky to have one with us today who's right in the middle of action, and not only in corporate travel, but also in retail and other forms of travel, who can throw a lot of light on what could be the scenario in the post-COVID environment. And, just to give you a brief background about Rakshit. Rakshit is the managing director of FCM Travel in India. And FCTG, as you know, is a global organization headquartered out of Australia. And, they in India, they operate in multiple lines of businesses. They do corporate travel, they do travel tools retail network, they do travel money for currency, they do MICE, FCM incoming, South Asia, DMC, and they've got almost, if I talk about corporate travel, they've got almost 18 corporate offices and 50 leisure stores operating all across India. From travel money, they have 42 conveniently located stores. Now in Corona, I'm sure some of them may not be operational, but that's the kind of presence they have. They also do travel representations around for cruise and group tours, which would be very interesting to hear from Rakshit, that how cruise industry is going to be evolving, and the kind of representations they do are big time in Venetian, Macau, Conrad, and more. And Rakshit, as a leader, has got more than 20 years of industry experience. Before leading the operations for FCM, he used to, he turned around and scale up the organizations like Thomas Cook in Canada, UK, and India. And he comes from we share the common background. He also comes from a consulting background from Roland Berger Strategy Consulting, based in the London office. And from that, he has forayed into travel and tourism industry, and he has really turned around companies of the size of Thomas Cook and now FCM, making it a profitable enterprise. And Rakshit is a well-renowned speaker. You might have seen him on Wiki panels. He constantly talks about, in a positive vibe, that what could be really the future of travel post-COVID, and what could be the steps taken by the industry as a whole to come together in these times. He's also featured in the 2015 edition of the Economic Times Spencer Stuart Top 40 Under 40. He looks young, but he's won
Not
that
anymore.
award almost 6 years back. So with this, a very warm welcome to you, Rakshit. We are so pleased to have you with us, and I'm going to hand it over to Ashish to have a conversation with you while I enjoy my coffee.
Thanks, Karthik. That was almost too kind.
Yeah. Well, Rakshit, I hope you get your coffee fast.
Actually, Ashish, it's Friday afternoon.
It's not your coffee time.
I might not do a coffee. I might do something a little more weekendish.
All right. So let's get talking. You've led, of course, with Karthik's own introduction, and otherwise large companies like Thomas Cook and now Flight Center and so on. And led some very strategic M&As of Flight Center here in India. Now, how do you see the overall situation? Let's have an overall view. And I'm particularly interested in knowing how the consolidation and M&A would pan out from here onwards.
Look, I mean, the overall view is a little bit like crystal ball gazing. So it, I'm not, nobody really knows for sure. But if you look at the long-term evolution of this industry in India, and typically what happens in shocks is people think that there are setbacks, but what you have is you have a temporary correction, and you might not have a full recovery, so there might be a permanent loss, but then the industries usually resume their long-term growth trajectory. That's what happens. So if you're growing, you might have a shock, and then you resume your long-term growth trajectory. So I think when we look back in time at this point, at this junction, this 6-month, 12-month period might, when you're in the midst of it, seem very tough. But when you look back at a long set of data, it will be a blip, just like we look at the GFC or at 9/11. When we look back today and you look at on a graph, it looks like a blip, right? It doesn't, when you're living it, it obviously feels like it's unending. So in that sense, I think the macros, the fundamentals, particularly India, are okay. I think despite the fact that only 1.5% of the Indian population travels internationally every year. 10% of the Indian population undertakes any form of air travel every year. So very low air travel penetration as a percentage of the general population by any benchmark. Despite that fact, we are one of the world's top 5 civil aviation markets, right? So I think the long-term prospects, the long-term trajectory of this industry, I think is still bright. I think the future is still bright. Of course, the near-term challenges are not insignificant. And I think for an industry that's far too fragmented than it should be, for an industry this scale, this size, we really should have a smaller number of larger players that are able to shape the market and buying behavior and pricing discipline and so on and so forth. That hasn't happened in the last 15 or 20 years. So whilst we've had some degree of consolidation, we've had lots of small IATA agents fall off a cliff. We've had some degree of M&A over the last 5 or 6 years, and you can see, I think I can see 3 clear sort of pillars emerging, and a fourth one is still perhaps yet to be built. But certainly, if you look at the first pillar, which is Make My Trip, Go Ibibo, Red Bus, and quite more recently Quest to Travel, and so on and so forth, you can see some degree of consolidation that's happened there. Another pillar, you see Thomas Cook, SOTC, TC Travel, to some extent Sterling Resorts, although I would say that's an adjacency rather than
Yeah.
at the core of what we do. And then you have the third pillar, which is a more recent aggregation of various businesses, which is Ebix, Mercury, Centrum on the FX side, and then Yatra now, although it remains to be seen whether or not that transaction gets consummated. But certainly if it does, then that would be a credible third pillar in this space. And then the fourth one is, that's still getting played out, and clearly, there are a few consolidators that are very, very large and could make waves in this market, particularly Ankush and TBO. There's people like us that are trying to put up a brave front, and you might have some new challenges that come across. But I think I think what we've seen from an M&A point of view and a consolidation point of view are early signs. I think more transactions will follow, although it will get harder and harder because there are few transformational scale opportunities left.
Right, right. So if you look at Flight Center, it's probably the only international company which is based out of Australia. I mean, most of them either German or the US or European, etc. And we all know what's happening in the US and European market. Australia is particularly untouched, if I may use the word, though nobody else is untouched. So do you see a reflection into the Indian market in terms of future investments for you? More look at India than Europe and US, etc., etc.?
I mean, it could be, right? So there are a couple of things, Ashish. I think one is, yes, I mean, well, Australia isn't immune from what's going on. They've had a 30-year uninterrupted economic boom that started to come off a little bit as commodity prices came off a little bit fairly recently. And they are, the Australian travel industry is under some degree of pressure. About half of our business is still in Australia, and it's a phenomenal market, right? For a country with 18 million people, for us to build a $10 billion business out there is really quite remarkable. But that's still the nerve center of what we do, and it's experiencing some challenges, and it would recover, no doubt. And from what we're seeing in terms of early indications, Australia and New Zealand seem to have handled the situation fairly well, and they seem to be, closer to or further along the path to normalization than many other markets. At some point in time, we will resume or rediscover our appetite for growth. At that point in time, we will look at various markets to see where capital deserves to be allocated. Clearly, the Indian market, like I said, low travel penetration, decent GDP growth level, even if it's at 4% GDP growth, that's the kind of growth most other countries would get their right arm for, right? But India has not been without its challenges, and I think in currency adjusted terms or in dollar terms, 10-year or 15-year returns in India haven't been spectacular. And we need to accept that. So from a shareholder value creation point of view, there are two ways to create value in this market. You can create operating returns, and you can create capital returns. Or in terms of operating returns, none of us have delivered that kind of step change in operating profitability to deserve to trigger the dividend payouts that foreign investors would find terribly attractive. And from a capital returns point of view, there may have been transactions or listings that could potentially unlock value, but most of those businesses are still burning cash, right? So I think there's a compelling opportunity for not just our investors or our shareholders to look at India from a long-term sort of growth potential point of view, and also as a counterbalance to China, because there's a little bit of now, there's uncertainty on how we look at China as a potential market and a destination for foreign investment. But on the other hand, I think we should recognize that Indian businesses and Indian portfolio investments haven't particularly distinguished themselves with respect to their international peers. And you can get 10-15% returns for much better, much lower risk, with a much better risk reward relationship in many other markets, right? So we also need to do more here on the ground in terms of fixing unit economics, fixing market dynamics, getting policy uncertainty as well, in order to deserve some of this foreign investment, whether from Flight Center or otherwise.
Right. So I was talking to one of my guests in the earlier show on the internet penetration and digitalization in India, and he made a statement that whatever we forecasted would be the penetration in 2022 will probably happen in 2020, obviously. And we've seen some signs of it happening. And you and I just had a discussion offline on what Baiju said about online learning and etc. And not really replacing the textbook, but making a deeper penetration. Now, the word technology itself in the travel vertical, and there are various avatars for it depending on what business you are in. I think it's a very loosely used word. And each one translates it in a manner they wish to translate it, whether technology means process or whether it means contents, whether it means digitalization and etc. So there are many of the businesses which are totally untouched and rudimentary as far as I'm concerned from a technology viewpoint, mice being one of them, for example, especially on the digital space. So can you just give us an overall perspective of how you see technology panning out? And more interestingly, Rakshit, I mean, a chain is as strong as its weakest link. So you got to evangelize it in a manner that technology reaches the grassroots. There is no point five people in the country harnessing all the possible technologies in the world. The trade is not going to be built on a very strong foundation. So what do you have to say?
Yeah, I think, look, clearly, we've seen more digitalization in the last 5 years, potentially in the last 5 weeks, than we've seen in extended periods of time, right? And I think we're at that unique sort of inflection point in time where actually hardware, software, connectivity, skills are all coming together. There's a confluence of factors that enables a greater degree of digital exchange. Also, there are constraints in place in our environment that forces you to trust digital delivery of products and services, right? So even if I had a strong marked preference for consuming offline, if I'm not able to consume offline, the choice then is whether I consume or I don't consume. And obviously, the consumption imperative will always be higher, right? So I think we are at that point in time where these things are coming together. I don't think we will follow any pre-established digitization path that may have experienced in any other part of the world, like the West or China for that matter, because we tend to have our own unique breed of what we do, how it works, what we value, what we don't value, what we are willing to pay for, what we are not willing to pay for, and so on and so forth. So I think our path will be different. You're right in that the travel industry, despite the fact that it's a highly technologically enabled industry, despite the fact that it was probably after credit cards, probably the earliest adopter of digital commerce practices in terms of GDS and the way airlines distributed inventory and so on and so forth. I mean, in the early 90s, you couldn't get a job in travel if you didn't know how to operate a terminal, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
that spread to
That,
other
that was the
industries.
criteria. Yeah.
Yeah, that spread to other industries much later. But I think we've been slow to enable sort of digital commerce. We've been, I think, fairly okay in terms of automating processes, getting efficiencies out. We had no choice because we had very low revenue margins, and in order to be viable at those revenue margins, we had to acquire a certain scale. In order to enable a certain scale, we needed certain platforms and so on and so forth. So I think the it's a little bit of a vicious circle, which is the industry has been investment constrained uh, because we're not able to charge for what we should be able to charge for, and we are not being able to charge for what we should be able to charge for because we don't have the products or the capabilities that we should have because we've been investment constrained for an extended period of time, right? And I think every time somebody's put the cart before the horse, and we saw that with Make My Trip, and we're seeing that in certain other pockets of the market today, whether it's Paytm, whoever else it is, whoever's put the cart before the horse is usually done quite well out of it. So when you create the capability, the demand usually follows, even though demand has not particularly envisaged what it wants. I think on the business travel side, there tends to be a high degree of automation, a high degree of digital adoption anyways, because our users are more sophisticated, the buyers of our service are more sophisticated. And I think the tone of the conversation is also changing, where I think it's no longer a procurement driven exercise. There's clients are now taking more of a holistic assessment. And I think, I spent 20 years in this business. I think for most of my career, when customers used to tell me, oh, we have a technical evaluation grade and we have a commercial evaluation grade, that the technical evaluation grade was really secondary,
Yeah.
if at all. And it was certainly, even if it was important, certainly not enough to countenance anything that happened on the commercial evaluation grade. I think over the last couple of years, we're seeing that shift, and we're seeing more progressive companies that see the power of digitization, that are adopting digital methods in their core practices and their core processes, are starting to disregard some of the commercial aspects because the transaction costs are really negligible, right? And you could effectively double transaction fees in our market and they'd still be negligible in the context of the overall value that's being managed, right? So I think that's changing. because it's changing, we're seeing new products come to market. Because new products are coming to market, we're seeing new capabilities being built around that. More established players are embracing some of these. There are young entrepreneurs are getting inspired to try and disrupt and do things in this ecosystem. So I think we're seeing the early sort of days of what could become an interesting trend.
Yeah. Just to add a liner to what you just said, in corporate travel, I certainly see consumerization coming in, because the line between an experience and a transaction is getting blurrer and blurrer. I mean, the corporate traveler guy is looking for the same kind of experience which you look as a consumer. So I think that's a big challenge the corporate travel division activity would have to harness going forward, be it in their self-booking tools or be it in their own platforms. Yeah, you think so?
Absolutely. I think it's, and it's a reasonable expectation to have, right? Because I don't know about you, right? But when I started my career, um, the kit we had in office was far superior to the kit we had had at home. So we
Yeah.
had better computers, better access to the
Right.
internet, better capabilities, right? Now it's almost the other way around, whereas for most of our guys, the kit we have at home or the kit that we have in our hands is far superior to what sort of companies issue as standard apparatus, right? And so expectations are going up. Also, I think human capital is becoming more and more critical to the company's success, and particularly in the knowledge economy, right, where they vote with their feet. So the employee experience is becoming more important. Back in the old days, you could almost disregard the employee experience because it was
Yeah.
about learning and climbing a ladder. Now it isn't, right? Now people are looking for a broader sort of engagement, sense of purpose, and a broader work experience that has a strong sort of personal emphasis to how they feel about it and how they connect to the organization. So I think you will absolutely see a consumerization. I'd like to say a productization, because I think this country has been very good at building tech but terrible at building products,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
So we have got lots of brains that can code, but the ability to turn all of that into a usable, scalable, desirable product has been long missing.
Absolutely. Well, moving from technology, and probably you're the right guy to move to, I want to move to the human equity, the human factor. And your company has just been awarded, I hear, as a great place to work in. And with so much disruption on human psyche today with COVID and what's going to happen, there's huge insecurity, obviously, in every area. So what are your sort of inputs for people who are listening in, people who have tuned in, and how do you see the industry adapting to these human challenges which are ahead of us?
Look, it's tough, right? And even our great places to work, Jenny, Ashish. I think what few people know is that we didn't make it the first time around. Yeah. And that it took us by surprise. We thought we were fantastic, right? I mean, we pride ourselves on our culture and we talk about it, and we talk about it as a basis of differentiation. And then the first time we participated, we didn't make the cut. And that was a real sort of eye opener for us, because we do a lot of customer research, we do a lot of supplier engagement, we try and keep our eyes open on the next big thing. But I think we don't do a good enough job of listening to what our own people are telling us, right? And that for us was a real realization. And I think what we did was we went to the ground and we put our ears to the ground. We started listening to what our people said to us, and it was triggered by the fact that we didn't quite make the cut the first time around, but it went on to become a much sort of broader driver of our strategy. So when we started listening to them on employee issues, we started listening to them on customer issues. When we started listening to them on customer issues, we started making decisions that were strategically more effective for us going forward. And it really changed the trajectory of our performance over the last 2 years. And for me personally, it's been a very humbling experience, because there's a lot of untapped knowledge, a lot of untapped expertise in the organization, and it lays there untapped because nobody asks for it, right? It's available on demand, but if you don't demand it, it doesn't come through. So I'm a big believer in a combination of tech platforms combined with human intelligence, right? Because I think the way consumers consume services or consume products is a function of what utility that product has, but it also is a function of how they feel when they're consuming that product, right? And manifests itself in different ways, right? So FMCG guys having a sustainability agenda, I will having a design aspiration achievement aspect to their products. For us, it's a duty of care thing, which is the one thing that we want customers to know that there should be absolutely no ambiguity about, is that no matter which part of the world you're in or what time of day it is, if you call me, I will solve it, right?
Yeah.
And it's easy to say, it's very hard to do, and it's only possible when I have 2,000 of my colleagues that feel exactly the same way, right, about every time that phone rings or that message pings or that email drops in their inbox, right? And I don't think we are fantastic. I think we're better than many other people. We should give ourselves more credit. I firmly believe that it is our culture and our people are a sustainable basis for competitive differentiation for us. We are able to just get much more from much less because our people care.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also believe, I think whether you're an employee or an employer, I think the relationship will change. The attitudes to each other will change. I think there are many things in our own personal relationships. We took it for granted. And each one of us are navel gazing to look at it. Are we doing it right or not doing? And I think that would change the whole model. Each one will look at each other in a different perspective.
Yeah, and even experiencing and navigating difficulty, right, Ashish? I mean, you can't navigate this sort of situation in a transactional environment. You have
Yeah,
to do it in a relationship
sure.
sort of environment, because otherwise your needs, your emotional needs are unmet,
Correct.
and you
Correct.
you you just can't manage it.
Correct. So, Rakshit, another thing I've strongly believed that TMCs such as yourself, Carlson Wagonly, American Express in the corporate travel world, they came into the India at a time when the original promoters were wanting to exit this business because obviously the pressures on commission, credit, whatever you. I mean, they came in at the right time. They brought something with them, right? And they continue to probably bring something with them. Without taking that away from them, do you see that India as a country could today foster global brands both in the TMC or the B2C space going forward? Or if not global as global, but Asia, probably an APEC, probably specific country-wise?
So I think we're overdue for a global business or a global business model, or a business that addresses global customers from India, right? I think it will. My hunch is, and I could be wrong. My hunch is it will start as a cost-based arbitrage-based sort of advantage, and it will evolve into a product/brand-led advantage, right? I'm not sure whether we'll be able to make that leap in one go, right? So, for an Airbnb or an Uber to be born out of India and rapidly globalize, I think there are lots of inherent constraints, right? But for a TMC, whether us or some kid working in his garage decides to disrupt the US TMC market from his garage in Bangalore or in Gurgaon because he or she sees that the pricing in that market is completely distorted, and there's a better, cheaper, better, faster way of doing things. My hunch is that will play out, and it will, it should play out on our watch, and it won't be just one. I think it'll be a few, and one or two of those may be able to then translate that early sort of cost advantage, if they make the right sorts of investments and the right strategic choices, into a more sort of product slash brand proposition that has global appeal.
Right. So lastly, without taking away anything from public sector travel companies, be it Bamalori, Ashok Travel and Tours, etc., I've been personally carrying a can that the government should relook at the way they procure their PSU travel. Simple from a factor that the governments are also changing. They're becoming more cost conscious. They're becoming more dynamic in their approach, etc. But I haven't been successful wherever I've spoken. Do you think things change later on going forward? At least if I may add, in a non-sensitive environment. I mean, I don't expect defense procurement to open it, but certainly the others.
So, Ashish, the global benchmark, okay, is that good governments, run good procurement processes. They encourage private sector participation. It's a competitive sort of process. There's price discovery, price transparency, capability discovery, and capability transparency, right? If you want my personal view, right, my view is India mein chhod do Ashish. Yeah, because what we are seeing from other sectors is when you pick up a public sector contract, liquidity becomes such a problem,
Right.
right? That unless we can ensure that public sector users of services actually pay for those services as per agreed terms, it is better to let the private sector concentrate on the private sector, right? And because we've seen that in infrastructure, we're seeing it in electricity, we're seeing it in lots of sectors, right? Which is, if you're, if the government owes you money and you can't get it out, yeah, what do you do?
Yeah, that's a fact. But anyway, one does hope the digitalization
I sure hope so.
in payment, etc., will get there.
I sure hope so.
How do you want to conclude this discussion? What's your overview? One line to the industry as you conclude.
Look,
and then we have Karthik, coming in with some questions he might have from the audience.
Yeah, look, my view is it's a storm, and it's it's stormy, but like all storms, it will pass. The longer term potential for mobility, whether it's managed sort of business travel, whether it's leisure or consumer travel, I don't think that's going anywhere. I think the long term growth prospects potential are intact. There will be near-term disruptions. There may be supply-side disruptions, which is some of the principal service providers may have to cut capacity in order to stay viable, and so on and so forth. But I think it's I practice what I preach. I think this is. I started as a generalist like Karthik. I don't need to be in travel. I didn't need to be in travel, but I firmly believe that travel can give me a rewarding career, can give me an entrepreneurial and professional journey that I may or may not get in another sector, and that's what keeps me going. I'm in an institution building phase of my career, and that's what I'm trying to do. So don't let it discourage you, because then the night is darkest just before dawn.
Right. But Karthik, over to you. We have some questions.
Yes, we do. And for me, the key takeaway, Rakshit, is how you talked about, humanizing technology and human-centered design, whether it's your employees or your partners. And in fact, our questions are around that. There are two streams to the sort of questions I've got. One is with whatever is happening right now, and I don't need to tell you, but you've seen that more and more companies now are feeling convenient and happy with restricting travels, and they are found their way comfortably to have people interacting over virtually. And we all know that costs are going to increase, so there'll be more and more pressure on employees not traveling. And at the same time, there also be an expectation of not having people, like in TMCs you have implants, so there would be less and less expectation of increasing transaction costs, putting more humans in the physical office space. So that would mean more and more customers also working from home, and more of your employees also sort of working from home. So it's a very different scenario, right? Everybody is working virtually. So how do you see that panning out in terms of increased cost pressures, one? And second is, how do you see that working sustainably? Like, implants used to work in a specific shifts, and call volumes around pre-transaction, post-transaction support requests would come in and they will solve it on the system. But with people working from home, sometimes internet connectivity is not there. I'm using an unsecured network. I'm sharing my devices. All those kind of nuances creep in. How do you see that you can deliver that sort of a amazing enterprise level experience to the customer still, while your employees are distributed remotely in different locations, and the cost pressures from the customer side? So it's a double whammy, if I may use the word for you, right?
So here's the thing, right? Which is, I have a little bit of a contrarian view on where demand for business travel is headed, because my view is, yes, right now everything is shut, and in order to make it through this crisis, you need to cut costs and you need to conserve cash, and obviously, T&E and marketing are soft targets, right? But once you're at the other end of this and you say, okay, now what, right? Which is I have to resume business. What does resume business mean? I have to restore my broken supply chain. Yeah. And I have to generate demand. To restore my broken supply chain, right? I have to forge new partnerships, build new factory. We're talking about production moving from manufacturing, moving from China to India. Will be a big beneficiary of FDI. Who is going to break ground on a new factory in India without looking at it, right? Not going to happen. Yeah. Um, on the demand generation side, what do you have to do? You have to launch new products. I mean, you look at auto, right? Not a single car was sold in the month of April, right? What are they going to do, right? They have to launch new products. They have to energize their distribution channels. They have to inspire customers to buy, right? And how are they going to do that? I mean, you can't do that remotely. Ek ad film banane ke liye you have to move people around, right? So this is not something that you can you can do remotely. So I think this is a temporary phenomenon. I think it will recover. I think the recovery will be sharp, and then it maybe it might not be full. So maybe we get to 50% of activity fairly quickly, and the journey from 50% to 100% is a little more long drawn out, and that's fine, right? But I think I would strongly advise my customers not to get too used to cost savings from travel, because unless you are the type of customer that I haven't seen in my portfolio, there are no profligate customers in my portfolio. Customers only engage in travel when they see a return on that trip, right? They're usually very high sort of policy controls around what they do and what they don't do. Um, on the other hand, I think that there certainly will be. So once they recognize that you look, this is, I have to travel, right? And then how is it that I optimize it? And then we might have discussions around cost structures, implants versus remote servicing capabilities. What is the entire spectrum of travel activity? What sits in a client environment? What sits in a service provider environment? How do we manage the boundaries? How do we shift them based on what kind of experience we want? What degree of controls we want to put in place? What degree of freedom and flexibility we want to put in place? Because I mean, we have many customers that have told us that they lose people if they don't like the travel experience, right? Because they work in the knowledge economy, people who vote with their feet and so on and so forth. So I think you're right in that there will be discussions around those cost structures, those delivery structures, with an emphasis on optimizing some of that cost, but equally on with an emphasis on improving some of those experiences, because in many ways those experiences are quite prone to friction, right? Particularly when you get into things like visas and all. Right. It's a real pain in the neck, right? So I think that there will be conversations, and I think the guys that are working on solving these problems and anticipating the challenges, because there will be other challenges. There will be challenges, entering airports, getting onto planes, qualifying for a seat on a plane once some of these restraints get lifted. And I think the people that are working on solving for these problems now are the people that will be able to help customers sort of work their way through this. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it works out. But like I said, I think there was already a significant scale barrier to viability in this market, which is my personal view is business travel under 1,000 crores of spend under management is probably unviable, and that scale barrier might go higher now.
Right. With this, we are completely out of time. Ashish, do you have any closing remarks?
Well, I'm a great fan of Henry Ford's quote, and I get reminded when he said, when everything seems to be going against you, remember an aircraft takes off against the wind, not with it. Right? So,
yeah. What a great thought to inspire us. With this, thanks again, Rakshit, for spending time with us on Coffee with Ashish. Really appreciate you sharing your ideas and suggestions. And I, for one, feel with your whole idea of how manufacturing is going to shift to India, which will actually lead to a lot more activity on the ground. That sounds surely a lot positive to some of the people who have asked me questions that what's going to happen. So with this, thanks again, Rakshit. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next week on our next edition. Till then, stay safe, stay at home, take care. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Rakshit. Bye-bye.